Today, as we continue our discussion of the elements of story, we are going to move on to a little bit more complex of an element, which is symbolism. So far, we've talked about plot, we've talked about characters, setting, and point of view. All of those elements are things that a story has to have. Symbolism is a little bit more complex of an element that some stories may not even have, but if they do, you have to have a decent understanding of those first elements in order to be able to understand the symbolism that is found within the story. But first, let's talk about what symbolism actually is. First, look at this shape, okay, and think about what this shape means to you. What does it represent? Most of us would call this shape a heart, and generally you're going to see it in pink or red instead of green. And for a lot of us, the first thing we thought of was love or Valentine's Day or something to do with romance. But think about it. What inherently about this shape means love or romance? Okay, this is not even the shape of an actual heart. You know, if we are thinking in terms of the heart as being the seat of human emotion, this is not even what a real human heart looks like. Okay, so this shape has somehow come to represent love. Here's another example. Look at this bird. Take a minute and pause and think about what this bird means to you. Again, there are possibly various answers. This is the U.S. bird, so you might have thought United States, endangered animal. You might have thought in terms of freedom, liberty, okay? Nothing about this bird, though, inherently means those things. It has just come to represent the United States and our freedoms. Here's another example. Take a minute and think about what this image means to you. Again, there are going to be various answers. Obviously, this is the United States flag, so you might have thought just simply United States. You might have thought about freedom or liberty, justice, any of those bigger ideals. But this is just simply a piece of fabric. Okay, here we have this image on a computer screen. In real life, it's just a piece of fabric that has some colors on it. So what inherently about that piece of fabric means the United States or freedom or justice or liberty? Nothing, but it has come to represent those ideals. So what is a symbol? Okay, all three of these images, all three of these items are symbols. A symbol is a person, place, activity, or object that stands for something beyond itself. Okay? That shape is just a shape, but it means something beyond what it actually is. It is representative of love. That eagle is just a living, breathing animal. It lives its life, it goes about its business, but it means something beyond that. That flag, it's just a piece of fabric, but it has been given meaning beyond its actual physical self. So that is what a symbol is, and those are real life symbols. Symbolism is just the use of symbols in a story. Okay, the use of symbols in a story. Now, these examples are, quite frankly, pretty obvious. We know what they are, we know what they represent. Symbolism, as I'm sure you know from past experiences in English classes or reading Spark Notes about a book or anything like that, symbolism in literature is going to be a little bit more complex. It's not necessarily going to be an obvious symbol. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to notice and determine. Here are some examples from literature, just so you can kind of get an idea of what symbolism looks like when it's not these obvious figures that we're familiar with. In Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven, the black bird, stands for death and loss. And, you know, the color black is in some ways an obvious symbol to us. There are some ideas and emotions that are already attached to black. And this poem kind of continues that. It's that specific bird that is symbolic of death and loss. In the novel Night, and forgive me, I'm not 100% sure how to say the author's name, Elie Wiesel. This novel is about his time during the Holocaust. He was a survivor of the Holocaust. I cannot remember exactly what country he was from, but he ended up in a concentration camp with his father. And he references night and nighttime a lot throughout the book. A lot of the stories of his difficulties happen at night. And so, you know, night is a literal thing. We sleep through the night. It happens every 24 hours. But in the book, it meant more than that. It represents death, obviously, because of what the Holocaust is. There was a lot of death surrounding him. It represents darkness, not just the literal lack of light, but just the dark tension and just the dark time that was. And then for him, it was also loss of faith. A lot of us probably know the story of Anne Frank, and she remained optimistic, and it was not so. It was not like that for him. He had a really hard time dealing with how terrible the actions were of people during the Holocaust, and so he lost faith in humanity during that time, and he used night to represent all of those things for him. And then you have To Kill a Mockingbird. This has obviously been my go-to literary example. It is one of my favorite books. To Kill a Mockingbird means that innocence is destroyed through evil. The mockingbird is a symbol in the book. It is mentioned once that it is a sin to kill a mockingbird. All they do for us is sing songs. They don't do anything to harm us, and so they should not be killed. And that idea is carried throughout the novel. The mockingbird in that phrase is used as a symbol for innocence, and many characters throughout the book are compared to mockingbirds. And I'm not going to give away what characters those are, but it's not just one character, there are multiple throughout, and the comparison is used many times. One thing you will notice about symbolism in literature is that these symbols, which again can be people, they can be places, they can be concepts, they can be objects, these symbols are carried on throughout the piece of literature. The raven, the poem is about the raven, so the raven comes back over and over again, and is mentioned. Night, again, many events happen during the night. He makes comparisons to night all throughout the novel. And then in To Kill a Mockingbird, multiple characters are mockingbirds. the comparison is made many times. So when you are looking for symbolism in a story or a piece of literature, look for things that are repeated. Which leads directly into our conversation about the story we read in class, The Story of an Hour. You guys already know to look for things that are repeated. After numerous readings of this very short story, I had you guys look for things that were repeated. Okay? Remember, these are nouns: person, place, things, ideas. What was repeated? What were the patterns? What were the nouns that occurred over and over again? And out of those things, what could be a symbol and what would it be a symbol for? What beyond itself could it represent? Okay, so I had you guys think about that and to write those ideas down. Look at your potential symbols. Look specifically to see if your hypothetical symbol matches the meaning of the story. So even if it makes sense, does it match what happens in the story? So here we go. Here are some of the symbols, some of the symbolism used in The Story of an Hour. If you noted that hearts and heart disease was mentioned numerous times, that numerous descriptions of the spring season were used, the description of the patches of the blue sky was mentioned several times, and even, and this is probably one you might not have gotten, but the chair was mentioned. These are all symbols. Okay, so I want to give you a minute to think about what these symbols could represent, especially if these are symbols that you did not write down. Based on what happens in the story, what could be the meaning of these symbols? Heart and heart disease specifically was mentioned twice, I believe, in the story. It was mentioned at the very beginning and the very end. The heart is traditionally a symbol of one's emotional core, the seat of human emotion. But this is a diseased heart, so that physical heart problem could be symbolic of an emotional problem, specifically as it relates to her marriage. It is kind of revealed, it's very slight, not super noticeable, but it is revealed that there is some unhappiness in her marriage, and that could be the problem that this is symbolizing. Springtime. Many different descriptions of springtime are used. In her room, Mrs. Mallard could see in the open square before her house the tops of the trees that were aquiver with the new spring life. And then it goes on from there. She has a potential for a new life. A new springtime, as it were. She has new hope for the future without restrictions. You could also say that the open window is a symbol for this. It's through that window that she sees the springtime, and the fact that the window is open could be indicative that her future is open to new possibilities. Patches of blue sky. There were also patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. Light was breaking through what previously had been covered. It's no accident that this light appears in the west, the end of the day. So if you were really, really keyed in on this, you could have even predicted that she wasn't going to live a long time like she prayed for. The use of the clouds being in the west could be classified as foreshadowing. However, without getting that deep, the blue sky showing, similar to the springtime, is that that hope for a new future without restrictions. And then the chair. Immediately after the news of her husband's death, Mrs. Mallard races upstairs into her room. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. The armchair symbolizes rest from her oppressive life and freedom from societal expectations. So she goes and sits in this chair immediately after finding out her husband has died. And while in that moment she is still upset, her husband's death is a release from those expectations for her. And even before she realizes it, that chair also becomes a rest for her. And so the chair is symbolic of that escape from societal expectations. Are there any other potential symbols or other literary elements that stand out to you? Is there anything you thought that was not mentioned here? If so, by all means, let's talk about it in class tomorrow. Write it down on a slip of paper, bring it to class, ask me about it, and we can have a discussion about anything else that stood out to you about this story. Also, think about other symbols that you have encountered in stories. As always, this doesn't even have to be just a book. It could be a short story that you talked about symbols from last year. I would love to hear about those. It could be a TV show you're into, a movie, a comic book, whatever. But what are some symbols that you are aware of in stories? What are they? What do they stand for? This time, I know I haven't had you do that in the past. This time I would like you to actually jot down a list. It doesn't have to be a long list, but I would like you to actually bring those to class for me to see before we talk about it, and that will be considered part of your homework as well. Have a great rest of the day, and I will see you in class tomorrow.